Marriage. In the 21st century, it's often a choice, a partnership. A celebration of love, or at least, it's supposed to be. You might bicker about dishes, therapy, or who forgot the anniversary, but beneath the surface, there's usually the expectation of equality, personal agency, and some form of mutual respect. Now, erase all of that. Strip away freedom, strip away affection, strip away safety. Replace it with obedience, suffering, duty, and a divine obligation to bear pain without protest. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Welcome to your marriage. Whether you were born noble or poor, male or female, your marital fate was largely sealed the moment you took your first breath. For noble families, children were pawns on a chessboard of alliances, land acquisitions, and bloodline preservation. Young girls were engaged before their bodies had matured, sometimes betrothed as toddlers. A child barely old enough to walk might already be promised to the heir of a neighboring duchy. Why? Because love meant nothing. Lineage was everything. Girls could legally marry as young as 12, boys at 14. And while consummation might wait for puberty, that was a flexible notion, especially for powerful men who didn't care. Peasant families fared only slightly better. They might choose their own partners, sometimes even marry for affection. But even then, local lords or priests could intervene, demand payment, or deny the union. The church strictly controlled who could marry whom, under what conditions, and on which days. Forbidden degrees of kinship were wide-ranging cousins up to the 7th degree, were off-limits without papal dispensation. Yet, paradoxically, incestuous noble marriages were common for preserving royal bloodlines. The hypocrisy was baked into the institution. Now imagine your wedding day. Forget white dresses and delicate lace. You might wear your best linen, but more often, your wedding was a handshake in front of witnesses and a priest's muttered Latin blessing. For peasants, it could take place outside a church door, with a quick exchange of vows, a firm clasp of hands, and then straight to the marital bed. No feast, no cake, no photos, just duty. And once married, your life was no longer your own. As a woman, you became your husband's legal possession. Your identity merged into his. You could no longer own property, sign contracts, or testify in court. If your husband died, you might be entitled to a dower, usually 1/3 of his estate, but only if his male relatives did indeed dispute it. And only if you hadn't displeased him enough to be written out of his will. And if you had no sons, God help you. You were now a financial burden, a loose end to be tied off with a second marriage or confined to a convent. But let's talk about what it meant to live inside the marriage. Your primary function as a wife was reproduction. The church declared that sex was permissible only for procreation, never for pleasure. If you enjoyed intimacy, you were suspect. If you initiated it, you were unnatural. The bedroom was no sanctuary, was a site of transaction, obedience, and often suffering. The rules governing sexual behavior were exhaustive. No sex during Lent, none during Advent. Not on Fridays, not on Sundays, not on feast days. Not during menstruation, pregnancy, or postpartum recovery. Not 40 days after childbirth. Not 40 days before Easter. Not during periods of fasting or penance. All told, married couples were restricted from sexual contact on nearly 250 days of the year. That left about 100 days where it was technically allowed, and, even then, it had to be performed with shame, in silence, under a blanket, in the dark. The church promoted the missionary position exclusively, and anything outside of it, from oral sex to enthusiastic movement, was condemned as sodomy or worse. It was believed that demons could enter a woman during orgasm, that sexual excess would call forth disease, and that too much pleasure made a woman vulnerable to possession. Birth control, non-existent or horrifying. Women attempted to prevent pregnancy by drinking mercury, tying amulets made of dried weasel testicles to their thighs, or inserting vinegar-soaked sponges, none of which worked and most of which led to infections or death. Abortions were illegal and punishable by excommunication or worse. So you got pregnant, over and over. A woman in the Middle Ages might bear 10 to 15 children in her lifetime. At least half would die. And the toll on her body was catastrophic. Malnutrition, anemia, pelvic trauma, uterine prolapse, these were common. You might be assisted by a local midwife. But these women had no formal training and often relied on superstition prayers, charms, burning herbs, even slicing onions to frighten the devil away during delivery. And life moved on. But perhaps the cruelest part of medieval marriage was the violence baked into its foundation. A husband had not just the right but the obligation to discipline his wife. If she disobeyed, he could beat her. If she displeased him, he could strike her. Law and scripture supported him. Manuals instructed men on the appropriate size of a stick, no thicker than his thumb, to correct a woman. Domestic abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. The Church, ever eager to preserve social order, advised women to suffer in silence. They were told to emulate the Virgin Mary in patience and obedience. A woman who complained was labeled a scold, a shrew, or worse. Towns had public punishments for such women. A scold as bridle was a metal cage fitted over the head with a spike that pressed into the tongue. It silenced speech and caused infections, bleeding, or death. Dunking stools were another punishment. Women were strapped to chairs and dunked repeatedly into freezing rivers. The community watched. Children jeered. Wives drowned. Justice was cruel, and escape was nearly impossible. Divorce, as we know it, did not exist. The Catholic Church ruled that marriage was indissoluble. Once wed, you stayed wed until death. Adultery, abandonment, or violence were not grounds for separation. The only escape route was annulment, which required proving that the marriage had never been valid to begin with due to consanguinity, fraud, or impotence. These claims were nearly impossible to prove and available only to the rich. For everyone else, the options were grim. Some women faked madness. Others ran away and disguised themselves as men. A few joined religious orders, trading domestic slavery for monastic seclusion. For men, the constraints were looser. A husband could effectively abandon his wife with fewer consequences. A husband was entitled to his wife's body at all times. If she didn't, she was pressured to join a convent or return to her family as a burden. Widows who managed to live independently were suspected of witchcraft. After all, what sort of woman lived alone? What sort of woman had power? What sort of woman survived? So no, you wouldn't survive a medieval marriage. Not as a woman, not as a man. Really, unless you were rich and cruel. The system was designed not for happiness, but for control. Marriage was not a union. 'Twas a hierarchy, a prison. A lifelong sentence dressed in the language of holiness, honor, and sacrifice. Your body was not yours. Your choices were not yours. Your suffering was sanctified. And if you dared to resist it, the church, the law, your neighbors, and your own family would all turn against you. So the next time you hear someone wax poetic about traditional values or how marriages lasted longer in the good old days, remember this: they lasted longer because you had no other choice. You stayed married, or you died trying to leave. And sometimes you did both.